Already?
Well, yeah, I'll be setting expectations at the start of the presentation. Are we ready to go here?
I think so.
All right.
All right, we good to go?
All right.
You got pizza?
Great, except my voice gets out. Can everybody hear me? Sort of? Okay. I'll have to talk to the back of the room. I'll have to. Okay, so I'm Robert Kiefer. My son Dash over here is in the blue. He's the expert of the rockets tonight. I have my obligatory photo of him. This is actually Dash at one of the high-power rocket launches that Oregon Rocketry does out at Brothers, Oregon. And he's actually here with the level 1 certification rocket that he made. And I want to talk a little bit about what high-power rocketry is, and sort of this community and event that takes place out there, because I think it's one of the real undiscovered gems of Bend and one, that you get living in Central Oregon. And I want to sort of tie that in with an application I've been working on that's written top to bottom in JavaScript. And so it's a bit of an excuse to talk about high-power rocketry, but I also know that folks here have pretty curious minds, so hopefully it won't be too uninteresting. And I'll give a demo of this app at the end of the night, and we can talk a little bit about the architecture. For those of you that are on Slack, you probably saw that I sort of stepped up to do this presentation like an hour and a half ago or whatever it was. So this is all in the last 90 minutes or so. I've thrown this together. So low expectations, ask questions. I'm happy to be interrupted if I'm skipping over anything or whatever. So that would be helpful to me. I have no idea how long this is supposed to run, so I guess that means I can't run long. Yeah, right. What is high-power rocketry? It's blank is what it is. Let's try that. Okay. Let's start with low-power rocketry. So I suspect many of you have seen these Estes rockets. It's a paper tube with some balsa wood fins, nose cone, and rocket motors that look about like that. They're little battery-sized things. This is a C motor. Rocket motors are graded by letter, so every subsequent letter is a doubling in power of the motor. So high-power rocketry is that, just bigger. So this is a high-power rocket. It's a paper tube with plywood fins, a nose cone, and a slightly bigger motor. This is sort of a low-power level 2 motor. It's an I or a J motor. So whatever the math is, like 10 times whatever, sorry, 2 to the 10th. So like roughly 1,000 times more power than what's in that little C motor. You guys are welcome to come up and play with these things if you're curious. So fundamentally, that's the difference. And there's a whole community of people that really get into flying high-power rockets. In the community of high power, this is pretty small. So this is a modest level 2. And when I say levels, I'm talking about certification levels. And there's 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. And I'll talk a little bit more about those at some point. I don't know where it fits into the agenda here. So the thing about high-power rocketry is that the size affects everything. It affects, God, I hope I didn't animate each of these. I did. So I'm just going to tap on this until I get to the bottom. All right. As you build rockets, one thing you'll discover is as you scale up rockets, and the reason I got into this sport is I built like a little A motor rocket, and I was like, ooh, I can do B motor, I can do a C motor, and I worked my way up to the D motors, and you kind of peter out there, like the hobby shops run out of it. But around that time, I found out that there is this high-power rocketry club, and so I've been kind of working my way up. And as you get to bigger size rockets, the weight gets bigger, the speed gets bigger, the altitude gets bigger, but you also need to learn about material strength, because the cube squared law means that basically as you increase the size of something, the relative strength of all the materials drops linearly compared to the mass of the rocket. So you have to actually have better construction techniques and better materials, and all of that makes things more expensive. But you're also dealing with fundamentally the kinetic energy law of 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So as these things get bigger, and you start getting close to Mach 1 or Mach 2, you start dealing with a lot of power, and that changes the safety equation. And so high power rocketry is a lot like low power rocketry, but you've got to be a lot more careful, and you've got to start working with clubs that have rules and regulations, and that can provide insurance and so on. And so that's kind of the overview of high power rocketry to start with, is we're sort of in that space. Locally, out here, so if you drive east out of Bend and you go right about there to Brothers, Oregon, you'll find, I don't think there's a gas station. There is the Stage Stop Cafe, so you can get a burger and a Coke. There's like 1 or 2 other buildings, I don't remember what they are. But then if you go from here, actually right here, and you go about there, you'll find crop circles, like literal crop circles almost. So this is the Oregon Rocketry high power launch site. And if you drive out there at the right time of year, you'll find a bunch of cars lined up. This is actually modest. Amazingly enough, Google got this on the day that they were doing a launch. But these circles here are the launch areas for low, medium, and high power rocketry. And once a month from April to October, a bunch of nerds go out there with the rockets and shoot up rockets up to anywhere from a few hundred feet to 40,000 feet. So the club has an FAA waiver at this site to launch rockets up to 40,000, 50,000 feet, which they occasionally do. That's pretty fucking cool. Sorry, Dash, you didn't hear that. So this is the point at which I forget what my next slide was. So, oh yeah. So that's all well and good, like, crop circles, cars. But I wanted to take a moment and show you just some video clips to give you a sense of kind of what it's like to actually be out there at these launches. And this ties into the app and why I'm doing this. So God willing. I won't force you to watch all of this, but just give you a little sense of what's going on here.
All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed the little tour of the flight line there.
All right, so let me just go back to this. All right, so that's kind of out there. There's a flight line, people walking around, lots of big rockets. I've got a spot in the video that we can actually show some of the launches. So this is like an Apollo, scaled down Apollo. You get a sense of the size there.
Going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
That probably went up to a couple thousand feet. It's on an H motor, so a little bit smaller than this one.
Going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Come on, release. All right, there we go. So this next one is one of the level 3, like very high power, if I remember correctly. Got up close to Mach 3, about 25,000 feet. So anyways, you get a sense of what's going on there. That last one, if I recall correctly, the chute didn't open and it ended up burying itself probably 6 to 8 feet in the ground. They never got it back. It's a lot of fun. There's, it's kind of like NASCAR. Like when stuff goes wrong, it's pretty spectacular. What's that?
Oh, it's coming.
It's actually I'm not gonna do the finding thing, but well, that's actually one of the really challenging parts of Brothers is that there's sagebrush out there, and you can see rockets for miles until they get under about 50 feet above ground, and then they disappear in the sage, and you got to be about 10 to 20 yards until you find them. So finding rockets is a real challenge. There are flight computers that have GPS transponders. There's radio locators. So for the really big stuff, you wire them up with what's that?
Apple AirTags.
It's not a terrible idea actually. So one of the little tricks of the trade is you get those personal alarms, that the little screamers that you can hit a button on, and you tape that to the shock cord so that when the parachute deploys, it pulls the pin and it screams at like 115 decibels. And so when you get close to it, you can start to hear it. But people, a rocket that goes to 5,000 or 10,000 feet on a windy day, it'll drift a mile or two. And people will spend like 3 or 4 hours walking around in the stage trying to find a rocket. In part because this is a $10 rocket. This is probably a $120 rocket. That last one we saw, like a high power level 3, people will spend several grand on just the motor. So imagine something like this, except about 6 to 8 inches across and about that long. That motor, just the reload, because the case is reusable, just the reload grains that you put in it costs anywhere from $800 to $1,200 for one launch that burns in 6 seconds.
What kind of accelerator is it?
It's ammonium perchlorate. Yeah.
I don't know
So
what that is, but it sounds really scary.
I don't either. I just know I know ammonium perchlorate, and that's what I had to write on the test when I got my certification.
So there's actually an FC on board.
Uh, on some of them, yeah, on the larger ones, and I've got it's an egg timer TRS, and it's basically accelerometer, GPS receiver, a transponder that communicates with a little hand unit, and that gives you real-time GPS altitude coordinates.
So it's really for telemetry. It's not really for guidance.
No, in fact, you're actually prohibited from doing any sort of active guidance on these,
Okay.
because it complicates the maneuverability. Like if the active guidance goes wrong, it really goes wrong. Whereas these are just ballistic, so they're kind of predictable. So that's high power rocketry. That's Oregon Rocketry out in the high desert. These launches are open to the public. So if you go to OregonRocketry.com, they have a calendar and you can see when they're going to do that. They're a ton of fun to watch. It's a super friendly community. So if you have kids or are just curious, you can head on out there. You will be asked to sign a waiver because they are inherently dangerous. We'll talk to that in a moment. Yes. So that video was from it's called NXRS, the Northwest Extreme Rocket Show. It's the June launch that Oregon Rocketry does every year, and it's the one that they sort of promote. And there's typically, there's usually a few hundred RVs and cars out there, and people camp out for days. So it's a 4-day event. So that's kind of the big one. If you're gonna pick one to go to, that's the one. There are other high power clubs around the country, and so if you go to Black Rock, where Burning Man is held, but you go a week early, there's I think it's the Balls launch, which is kind of like this, but with flights up to like 100,000 feet plus, and it's where like the really crazy stuff goes on. That's it for sort of multimedia stuff. This is just me talking at this point. The thing about high power rocket launches is that they're actually fairly complicated because you're putting rockets that weigh 50 or 100 pounds up to 10, 20,000 feet. There's just a lot of kinetic energy there. And when they come down uncontrolled, it's spectacular in the sense that you hear them, but you typically don't see them. You'll just be like, it's up there somewhere, and then you'll hear like this whomp, a quarter mile or half mile away. And it's after the fact, you're like, that was not good. So anyways, because of this risk, because there's a lot of people and there are rockets up in the air over this, these launches have a fairly strict process around them. And it starts with the certifications. So I've mentioned level 1, level 2, level 3. There's a process for getting certified. You have to take a test. You have to demonstrate that you can build a rocket that will fly safely. And really what the certifications dictate is what size motors you're allowed to purchase. And that's how sort of the certification side of things is regulated. There are launch officers who are people who are trained both in evaluating the safety of a rocket. So you'll before you fly any rocket at these launches, even a little Estes one like this, you present it to a range control officer, a range safety officer. They will look at your rocket. They'll ask you questions about the motor, about the center of gravity and the center of pressure to make sure it's aerodynamically stable. And then they will sign off on it and say, all right, you can fly this. There is a launch control officer. That's the guy that's at the switchboard dictating what rockets are launched when, and making sure that people are on the safe side of the flight line and just managing the whole flow. And then last of all, there's the launch and the recovery. So as we discussed, there's recovery hardware. You have people out sort of in the boonies looking for rockets, and you got to keep track of all of this. And that's where things kind of get interesting from a bureaucracy standpoint, because these launches, when you're out there, it turns out.
I got to run things.
Yeah.
So it's nice meeting everybody.
It turns out these launches aren't actually run all that well. Technically, when you get there, everybody who goes there is supposed to check in at a registration table, and you're supposed to get a band that says, I've got, I'm a visitor, or I've got a level 1 or level 2, so that people know sort of what areas of the launch site you are and are not allowed to go to. The safety inspections. I think I have them here somewhere. Can you hand me that little card right by my? Yeah. So this is a flight card, and I know most of you can't see it, but it has something like 20 some fields on it. If this was a web form, it'd be an absolute disaster. And it asks things like, what's your certification organization number? When does it expire? What level is it? What kind of, is this a first flight for this rocket? Is it complex? Does it have more than one motor? It asks for details about the rocket, who the manufacturer was, what size motor it has, and so on and so forth. And you have to fill this out every time, even if you're flying the same rocket on the same motor over and over. So it's, from a process standpoint, especially for UI design people, it's one of those things you just kind of go like, oh my God, really? So the flight cards are difficult and repetitive. They are easily forged. There's a little spot here for the RSO to initial that they've checked off your rocket, but you go up to the table, you grab one of these, and you scribble something on there. You can anybody who wants to could fly a rocket. It's basically an honor system, which is not great. For the launch control officers, that's the person that's sitting at the table out in the middle of the high desert in summer when it tends to be windy. Like, this shit flies around. So there's times when these things have scattered all over the stage, and it tells you who's got what rockets out on what pad numbers. And we've had cases where these have gotten mixed up because somebody's written the wrong pad number, and then an officer's going to launch something like this, and inadvertently launch that that rocket that costs like $3,000 and $1,200 a launch. And that big rocket that's up on the hill behind everybody has taken off with nobody being aware or prepared for it. So it's led to some pretty kind of dodgy situations. And then when it's all said and done, after like the NXRS, when people have flown 400 or 500 of these, the club officers take those cards back, they collate them, and they put them into a database and generate a report of how many people were there, how many rockets of what size motors were launched, so that people can feel like, well, how successful was the launch and who was launching what. But it all starts with paper, which is a data entry nightmare. So that was sort of the inspiration for my like, hey, I should build an app. And then there's a few other things that are like sort of bonus features that are missing, which is you don't really know who's at the launch unless they've actually filled out flight cards. And then there's just no way for those people to interact and really engage beyond like walking around and talking to folks, which, ew, like who wants to do that? So all of that has led to this, flightcard.org, which is a prototype, but if anybody happens to have a laptop or a phone, if you want to type that in and log in, you can follow along. This is a real-time application. So it would help if there were actually some real-time activity. Yeah, let's just give it a shot. This is an ad hoc demo. So I will, if anybody's actually logging in, it should work on mobile. It'll ask you to log in if you don't mind providing your Google login. Let's see, and it's going to be here and probably this one. That's not it. Where is it? There it is. Okay. All right. So I'm going to actually, let me go back here and, oops, hold on. This is not big enough. I've forgotten how to log out of my own app. Oh, here we go. I think this is it. Yeah, here we go. All right, so yeah, so you can log in with Google. It's this is basically all built on Google's Firebase system. So you get free authentication through that. I'm going to log in as me, and it's going to ask me. Let's see, show your certification to launch officer. So I'm actually going to come over here. Sorry, I'm talking to myself.
Is this all dev?
What's that?
Is this dev? If we push buttons on here?
Oh yeah, you can knock yourself out.
Okay.
It's all like fake data and stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see. I've totally forgotten how to do this. Let's see. Not off duty. Here. Oh, right. So it tells me where I can declare my certification. So I can say I'm EEE or NAR. Those are the two certifying organizations. And I'm going to say I'm a EEE level 3, which is like the most badass of those. And it should, yeah, so it's telling me, like, I've declared my certification, but now I have to actually go and prove that. So I have to go find one of these people, which are the launch officers. So these are the other people who've logged in and said, like, hey, I'm so-and-so. And then I have to actually show them my certification card and get it verified. So that's, that's sort of the first part when I show up. I don't know if anybody's logging in here, but if I want to launch a rocket, I can go and look at my flight cards. So I've got flight cards set up. I can click on one of these. Like I've got Dilbert's last strip is ready for review by a rocket safety officer. And one of the fun things about this is that determining whether or not a rocket is actually safe to fly is not a simple problem. Like you've got to take the weight of the rocket. You've got to figure out where the center of mass and gravity and center of pressure are. But you also have to determine, does it have enough thrust to be at an aerodynamically safe velocity when it clears the launch rod. And that, like most of these range safety officers, they do that in their head because they've been doing it for so long. But like, you never know for sure. So this form actually does that on the fly. So I've got, this is a multi-stage rocket. And I can do, so it's telling me the thrust to weight ratio over here is 74:1 and it's safe to fly. But if I'm gonna remove some of these motors. And if I take this from an I motor and I make it a D12, so here's an SD12, it'll tell me that it's no longer at a safe thrust level. Now I might decide that's okay if the motor has enough thrust when it first launches, because we only really know the initial. So I can click over here and I get the full thrust curve for this motor. So, so having an online form gives you extra insight that actually improves the safety of these launches.
Is that thrust curve generated, or is that like all hard coded that matches up with the different components?
So this data comes from a site called thrustcurve.org. So there's basically a guy out there who takes all of the commercially available motors and gathers the thrust curve data. He's got an API online, which is great. I turned this into a JSON file that gzips down to like 200K. So it's available anywhere all the time. It's great. Let's see. Yeah, so you can, there's lots of other stuff here. I can see let's see, I've forgotten what this is. Oh, yeah, so this is the Rso tab. It shows me all of the rockets that people have submitted for safety review. So I can go and look at these. Actually, we were just looking at this one. I can go look at at Herman Bourne's. I can go see his rocket. I'll speed this up. There's the launch control officer. So this shows all of the pads. So we've got a high power rack up at the top. That's one of those circles. There's low power, mid power. So this shows us where all the rockets are and who's actually out on the range at any given time. And I think I'm tech. Yeah. So I'm actually my role right now is a launch control officer. So down here at the bottom, I can close the range.
Attention, range is closed.
And that goes out in real time to everybody I don't know who's got their phone, but in theory, that will alert you, like regardless of whether you're in your RV or you're out in the sage looking for a rocket, it'll tell you like, hey, there's stuff going on. The range has been closed, like stuff's going to launch soon, which is a big problem because the only way the launch controller currently has of communicating is through a loudspeaker system that's run along the flight line, which if you get more than about 40 yards away, you can't hear. And then the last thing is who's at the launch. So everybody who logs into the app shows up on the attendees list. So I can see like, is my buddy Fred at the launch today? Yeah, so that's in a nutshell the way the app works. I won't bore you with any more details on it. The neat thing about it is the entire thing is built on top of the Firebase real-time database. And I've got a little hook. So I don't know, for those of you who are or aren't familiar with the real-time database, it's basically a data store that looks like a giant JSON data structure that you can set and get properties out of at any node in that data structure. And that change will be published in real time to everybody that's connected to your application, which is really cool. And I don't know that I have a great way of demonstrating that at the moment, but one of the things I did with this early on is I made a little React hook that says like, use data store, and you provide it the path to like the part of that data structure that you want to render your component from. And so literally, like if I change something over here, like I don't have to think about the connection. As soon as I tell the data store, like, hey, set this property, like the process of sending that to the back end and publishing that out to all the connected clients is just sort of automatically, magically taken care of. Like I can just think about the client side and what JavaScript going on, and it works great. It's fantastic. I developed with Parcel, so which is a bundler, and it works well. It does JavaScript, it does TypeScript. So I ported this all to TypeScript last year, and then I deployed it to Vercel. So again, like my only backend is the Firebase, so I don't have a server that I need to deal with. So it's a serverless, single page React parcel Vercel app. So that's my presentation. I'm pretty sure I don't have anything else at this point. Yeah. So. Happy to answer questions.
How often do you go shoot rockets?
It's mostly during the summer, and they have launches once a month. So and I'll go to Pine Nursery occasionally and launch little stuff. But yeah.
Has the rocket gone 6 feet into a car?
Nobody's been hit, at least not in Oregon Rocketry. There have been a couple of incidents at other club launches over the years, but fortunately it's very few and far between. But yeah, I mean it's one of the, like, every once in a while you're out there and you're just like, yeah, this could go bad.
How's the 3G connection out in Brothers Oregon?
That is a great question. And the answer, it turns out, is pretty good if you have Verizon. So that's, and that's, as many of you who have built production apps for mobile know, like, connectivity is one of the critical issues. It's not, like, I very deliberately have said up front, like, that's not my problem to solve. This is an online app. I'm not doing any, there's no like offline data synchronization. Like I mean, the whole point of the app is to give people real-time insight into what's going on. So I've dodged that question. Fortunately, most clubs at this point have enough other reasons to have connectivity at these launches that it is a concern for them. And in our case, like, if you've got Verizon, you can do it. You can set up a hotspot for other people who don't. Like, it's not bad. So, yeah.
Have you used it in production?
I've been promoting it to the club very gently. So I know the club officers. I've demoed it to them.
It's kind of something you have to get everybody on.
It is. So I probably so last year I had a couple launches where I was sort of out there with a couple iPads showing people. I'll probably try and get a couple of the RSO and LCO officers to agree to use it sort of off to the side as sort of a prototype path. But asking the entire club to depend on it for a launch is it's a big ask. So yeah, so it's a fun project. Never going to make any money off of it. There's just it's just not enough people. So it's a passion project, and however long it takes. I've got other work that I have to attend to. So, any other questions?
So for the largest rockets, aside from looking awesome, is there something that people try to get out of it, like a video recording, or they study the telemetry, or something like that?
Different people are in it for different reasons. It's like if you ask people, why do you program? You get surprisingly varied answers. Some people like to go as high as they possibly can. There's a whole subculture around setting altitude records for certain motor sizes. One of our members holds like 3 records for that. Some people they just like the entertainment of watching them go, so they'll use really low power, long burning motors that just kind of that just burn for 20, 30 seconds and have these sort of long, graceful launches. Other people like building motors, so there's a whole community that actually makes their own motors and mixes the perchlorate fuel. Some people really get into the painting. Some people like doing scaled down models of actual rockets. There's a guy out there that has like every Apollo, every flavor of Apollo that he's built at various scales. So it's a little bit of everything. So yeah. All right. Thanks everybody.
All right.
Thanks, dude.
you'll click on the row, and then you'll wait for it to that bold
Should I do it?
Not a lot of enthusiasm, people. You are? You're ready. I'm going to give my talk just to you. Kyle's ready. Who's ready?
I'm ready.
Robert's ready. I need one more person who's ready. Mark's ready. Yes! All right, I had to throw this thing together. There were some cancellations. This is an incomplete talk. Might be some missing slides. Please forgive me. The title of the talk is Websites Are Good Now. Let's move on. Here's some things that we're going to talk about during this presentation. There's a whole list of them. We're going to talk about web typography. It's not all about JavaScript, but I promise there's some JavaScript in this talk. So get ready, people. Const, lets, all those things. Web typography, just in case you didn't know, it's good now. Image handling on the web, come a long way, good now. Layout, really good. That's a great section, you're gonna love it. Building with components in general is something I'm bullish on, you're gonna love it. Animation, good now. Edge functions, have you seen these things? Blow my mind, so good. Hosting in general, it's come a long way, it's good now. In order to tie the whole room together, because I was just reflecting on how good the web has gotten, hence the title of it. Because it's good. It really has gotten good. I decided to build a website just for this and like use new stuff, right? So I just for science reasons, I went around town and I got a breakfast burrito every day from somewhere, and then I rated them. And then I built the site based on that. So it's live now in case you want to hear my evaluation of all the breakfast burritos in Bend. It's a subdomain, which are cool again, at my personal website. So that's it. But the website itself doesn't matter that much, but it does exist and it really does tie the room together here. So websites are good now compared to when, and I was like, ooh, I should have thought of that before I started the presentation, right? I was kind of thinking, even just relatively recently, a lot of this stuff has gotten a lot better. But then I was eating lunch. Me and Robert eat lunch at Brother John's every single day. If you want to, if you want to come talk to us, that's where we'll be. And just saying. But Robert has a long history on the web, and he was showing me some stuff from his resume from circa 2000, let's say. He worked at a company called iMaze that made these weird. This was like make a slide deck. there's probably people in this room that could sketch out a slide deck in React app in like an hour. You know what I mean? Like the times have changed, right? It's not that hard of an app to build, but at the time it was really hard. There was no Ajax, there's no stuff like that. They make this thing, which I'm sure took a team of 1 million people or whatever. The company sold for $60 million, I hear. So like the web compared to 2000, which isn't that long ago, it's way better. Like it's hard to even think about that scope of difference. So I'm not talking about that. I'm not going to compare. I can't. Everything is better. Like a div is better. You know, like everything is better. So let's start with web typography. The least interest of probably anybody in here, but let's just do it. I'm hanging out on Typography Twitter, you know, and I see this great foundry called Mass Driver drop this font in the middle of last year called MD Primer, and something just hit with it. I thought it was a really nice font. It's serious, but a little rounded, not terribly serious. I just really liked the font, and then I go check it out. Yeah, anyway, it ends up being like the header font on CSS Tricks. I liked it that much. I wanted to use the thing. But one of the things that compelled me about it was that there was some innovation in font licensing. A lot of times when you buy a font, it's like, how many page views is it? 1 million? Well, then the font is $1 million or something. The fonts can be like crazy expensive. And anyway, and that always annoyed me, and I thought it was cool that their license was based on how many people work at your company. And I was like, well, it's one, basically. So in this case, I got under 5 employees, perpetual commercial use for 360 pounds. I think it's a great price for a really professional font like that. Then whatever, you go through the rigmarole, you download some dumb zip file or whatever, and it gives you a bunch of crap. Here's MD Primer, there's what you get. The OTF files are open type, which means you can use it locally in your design software. You could make VS Code, use it, whatever. So you need that, might as well get that, that's cool. But the other two, WAF and WAF2, those are designed specifically for the web, and notably it only gave you that two. WAF2 particularly interesting, it's just WAF but better. And it's a quite small file format, all good. So it just occurred to me, I was like, I should look up, like, what does it take these days to use a font on the web? You know, I feel like 5 years ago, you had to have 5 different formats, and you had to say a special incantation to use them, whatever. But now, it's like a background image. You just link up a fucking WAF2 file, and then you call it, and that's it. That's literally all you have to do to use a font that you just bought from the internet. It's just gotten better. It's just way better these days than it used to be. So that's kind of cool. And you know, what about browser support? Like, well, I don't know, IE11's about as deep as anybody goes anymore. And to do that, you just add a second format for WAF and you're done. So like, even that has gotten a lot better. So I slap it on the Breakfast Burrito site too, because I think it's pretty cool. I came from a time on the web when if something went wrong with an @font face declaration in CSS, something like that would happen. Or if you're like, on the bus and the web is slow or something and it doesn't load, there was some browsers in some situations where just none fonts would load, which is so wildly unacceptable experience on the web, you know, like that can't be a fail state. That was crazy. That was like a bad, people got pissed about that kind of thing. Not to mention, I bet even these days that would count as a first contentful paint. Don't you think it would? Which is BS, I think. There ain't no content. Okay, so CSS steps in relatively recently, not like this year or anything, but I think in the last couple of years. Font display ships. It's a special CSS property that only works within @font face declarations, and it just says, how do you want it to behave? Just tell me. And font display swap, which is a pretty popular one, it's now the default for all Google fonts, which is kind of a big deal because they basically own the market for custom fonts. It just says, I'm going to wait like barely any seconds at all, but I'm going to give it a fair chance for MD Primer to load, and then I'm not going to wait any longer. I'm going to render the fallback font, and then if it ever loads, I'll replace it with the font, which has this swappy effect, but at least you don't get the no font thing, which is the worst possible situation. There's also a value for it called optional, which means I'm going to wait no seconds. Yeah, basically. And then it will render it in the fallback font, but it will never swap. Because some people really don't like that, like swapping of fonts. It will just never do that. But it will load it in the background, so then the next page load it will use the proper font. That's CSS stepping up with one dumb little line of code that totally solves this entire problem that plagued using custom fonts on the web forever. All right, enough of that. Fluid type, It's the coolest thing. Everybody's like, font size 16 pixels or whatever. Boring. Never do that again. Fluid type is the coolest new way to do this on the web. Here's what I mean by fluid type is that there's a connection between what's going on the page and what size the font is. And it can be a little subtle, but just look. This is a little movie deal. Like the size, like just look at fluid type at the top. It gets a little smaller as the screen size gets smaller, and it gets kind of bigger when it gets bigger. It's a bit of a calculation of how big that thing should be. And it's particularly nice, you know, you can set up a whole system for it, essentially, which I think is cool. This website is a particularly nice way to do it. Fluid-type-scale. You enter some information like how small do you want it to ever get, how big do you want it to ever get, and it gives you some of those things with the dashes over there are CSS custom properties. They're just variables in CSS that you can use to then size your type. So it ends up kind of looking like this. And that special thing, clamp, is a new-ish thing in CSS. It takes 3 parameters, the middle one being the important one. That's a calculation. It's always a calculation. And it says, I'm going to run that calculation. I'm going to cap it, though, at that, and I'm going to, at the tie end, and cap it on the bottom at the low end, meaning that it's a calculation, but you can put parameters on how big or small it ever gets, that value. And it's not just for font size, it's literally any value you want in CSS. And VW is a unique thing in CSS that's like, what percentage of the entire viewport is it? So that unlocks this whole ability of fluid type, meaning if you just set up some custom properties like that, then in the rest of your entire app, just only use those to size type, and you have a perfectly beautiful fluid type system for your entire website. I couldn't imagine doing it any other way now. It's just the nicest way to do it. Did I make a little movie on this? You can kind of see the size of the fonts on the site kind of reflect how much space it has. It's subtle, but it's just nice, you know? You might as well do it that way, rather than having media queries that kind of choose how big they are and stuff. So web typography, great options, great licensing available. It's so easy to just use at FontFace WAF 2. It's performance friendly. Clamp is great. And variable fonts, I didn't even mention, but I just thought they're such a cool idea. You link up one font and then it's got all these things you can change about it. And it depends on how the author of the font did it. But like, look at that. That's one font file that's animating how thick it should be. So that's not like, I don't know, After Effects or something. That's somebody that just puts spans around each letter and is using CSS animation to do the thickness of the letter. Meaning that you don't have to have 5 WAF files for normal, 500, 800, 900, or whatever. It's just one file and it can handle all that. And a lot of times it does slant. There's really weird ones that like grow flowers out of the serif. You can invent any access. It's just a cool technology, and I just mention it to be a look into it kind of thing. Changing gears a little bit, images on the web. This was fascinating to me for a burrito site because I wanted to put a bunch of pictures of burritos on the site. How do you do that responsibly these days? There's a ton of things. There's this concept of responsive images, which means you have an IMG tag in HTML, but you got to give it source set, which is a big list of different sized images that the browser can then choose from. But you got to give it a sizes tag that says, I'm gonna render at this size, and with those 2 pieces of information, it can choose the right one. It's a pain in the ass. But you kind of got to do it if you don't want to serve too big of an image, because that's really penalizing people that don't need a 2,000 pixel image, you know? Anyway, that's a whole thing. We're not going to get too much into it. But you also want to be like, well, this new browser, Chrome, it supports AVIF, some fancy technology. It's amazing, the tiny, tiny images, but Firefox doesn't support it yet. So ideally you serve one to one and one to the other. That's the right thing to do when you're serving images. Ideally you serve it from a CDN. Ideally you optimize it. Ideally you lazy load it. The list goes on and on. It's not just an IMG tag anymore. It's crazy town. There's all this crap you have to do. But here's what I want to do. I want to throw a burrito on a plate, take a picture of it with my fancy-ass camera that outputs the world's largest fucking image of it, the thing, and then just wipe my hands of it, and then just be done. So that's what I do. I take all these dumb pictures of burritos and I just send them right to Git, which I'm sure is abhorrent to some of you because little 4 megabyte things in your Git. Git wasn't exactly designed for that, but I've been doing it forever and nobody yells at me, so whatever. So I kick it to Git, and now it's just part of my build of my site, right? Let's solve every single thing on that image checklist at the URL level, which I think is a cool thing that multiple companies are offering, but we'll look at how Cloudinary does it. I know that's hard to see, so we'll zoom into different parts of this URL, but this URL solves every one of those problems. Number 1, it's hosted by them, not me anymore. Bandwidth is no longer my problem, and it's a cookieless global CDN, so whatever, we'll use Cloudinary in this case. At the way end of the URL is the canonical source, meaning my website. It's a URL within a URL, just happens to work in that way. And then in the middle of the URL, I can tell it to do all this stuff. I can say, serve it in the best possible format, and it just works somehow. I don't know how, it probably looks at headers and crap, I don't know, it does smart shit. QAuto in the case of Cloudinary means optimize it before it gets there and optimize it however you feel like it should be optimized. And then that blue one is important and it says serve it at 1200 pixels wide in this case, not 6000 because that's crazy. Serve it at 1200 and then make the height whatever is relative to the width in that case. So we just solved that entire checklist of things just at the URL level. So I don't have to do anything as long as I set up the system well enough. I can use URLs like that, but it's kind of funny in that that's what it needs to be on production, and that's what it needs to be in dev. You know, it just needs to be like local URL. So you kind of have to do a little like dancing with. I don't expect anybody to care about this code, but I'm like, is it on production or is it on staging? If it's production, do all this elaborate dancing of constructing the URL just how it needs to be. But that's nice because then on dev, I just see my local images. And on production, based on an environment variable, it crafts all the crap it needs to do. That's how it ends up in the DOM on production, is just this huge group of images kind of ready to go. So it's nice. So workflow-wise, I'm still just like, doop, get done. You know, I don't have to think about it. It's not part of my build process. It's nothing. You just take the photo, you send it up, and it's kind of a solved problem. And I talked about Cloudinary, but there's other crap. Even our image handling on CodePen maybe isn't quite sophisticated because it can't pull a canonical image source, but every other thing it can do. It auto-optimizes, it can serve in different sizes and all that stuff. So it's not rare. There's lots of companies kind of helping out with how difficult images have gotten. There's a few other crap you have to do too, but whatever. I can't do it all. It's a quick meetup. Let's just take a breather and look at the very hungry caterpillar being animated. It doesn't do anything. It's just, that's all it is. All right, let's talk about layout. Layout is the best thing in this whole talk. It's so good. It's gotten really, really good. You want to make a grid of everybody's got, every website in the world has cards on it. It's like the most common component ever. And you have a grid of them, however many fit kind of thing. Look at it. I temporarily turned off all the content area just so you could see more cards. Look at this great responsive layout of cards. Oh, can only one fit? No problem. That's how mobile works. Oh, do you have more room? Make more columns. Here's more columns and more columns. What a wonderful layout. How sophisticated of a layout. That must be hundreds of lines of code, right, to express this incredible CSS layout. And in the past, it wouldn't have been hundreds, but you could pull it off, but it probably would be pretty difficult. You'd write breakpoints, you'd redefine how many columns they were and things like that. These days, through the power of CSS and CSS grid layout, you can say, have as many columns as will fit, and there's a little bit of elaborate stuff in there that says anywhere between the range of that minimum expression and one FR, which means a fraction of the remaining space. You know, we don't have to break down all the details of that, but it's a nice way to do it. Basically saying, I want them to basically be a break at about 360 pixels, but they have some flexibility. That makes that. Now let's do one more thing. I'm going to say grid template rows, masonry. Pinterest made this layout fancy. They made this very popular. And the idea is that grids are normally, you think of them as a checkerboard where they have rows that say the row stops here. So if the card's too short, too bad. The next card doesn't start until below that row. Masonry says, I kind of don't care about rows anymore. I care about columns, but rows, I'll just make it work. And it makes it work even with source order so that it maintains like a relevant kind of HTML source order. But you see how staggered they are as you go down. That's how the Pinterest layout looked, and that's how we can take advantage of it here. It's still an experimental feature. It only works in Firefox, but what the hell? It's kind of a progressive enhancement kind of vibe. Pretty cool. The hardest part is the source order thing, which I can't speak to too much. But let me say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do the willy-nilly however many grids thing. I'm going to say I only want 2 columns, so that's how I'm expressing 2 columns. And then on really small screens, I'm just going to go 1 column. That's all I'm going to roll with on the Burrito site for now. But what I want to do then is say like, okay, so it's only 2 columns even on really big screens. What I want to express though is if this card itself has enough space, I want it to respond to that. I don't care how big the screen is. I care about how much space the card has. And if the card is big enough, then rejigger its layout to take advantage of the different size. That's the whole thing of container queries, which is a brand new thing in CSS. Is incredible. So imagine a component doesn't have to think about the blue line anymore. It doesn't have to write stuff that says, oh, I need to make decisions based on the blue line. It's like, whoosh, I only care about myself. So it's perfect for me, really. I only care about how wide I am, and I'll make design decisions based on just me only, which is great. So this is how it works. You need an additional wrapper these days, because the reason this didn't exist is because it's freaking weird and complicated for browsers to implement. So here's the kind of the compromise, and this is what's going to eventually get shipped here pretty soon. Let's say you have a container element. Ooh, I have a typo. I'm going to fix it. Card container. Why can't I click it? Container. See? Thanks for being the guinea pigs. That container has this new CSS property saying contain the inline size of it, which is relevant. We won't get into it too much. But then that thing, that at container, it used to say at media, right? That's how you write the big container. This is just saying that container that you just contained, you can now restyle it in certain circumstances based on its size. That's huge for CSS. I've been writing about CSS for 15 years. It's the biggest thing that's ever happened to CSS.
After the act container query, you can say card container as well.
No, you can't. You cannot style the thing that you query against. Hence the wrapper on the top. You can only style stuff that's inside of it. Otherwise, it opens up cyclical looping problems with how the browser does stuff. Don't quote me on that. There's a reason for it, though. You cannot style the thing that you query. So it's on purpose, it's styling the inside element there.
No, I just mean right after where it says container, it says card wrap again. Is that another?
Oh, that's because I named it card wrap here. That's the name of it, so it has. Then you're calling the name of it there, you know? Yeah, anyway. All right. So I'm going to restyle the card component. If the container gets big enough, I'm going to style it like that, because I think that's taking advantage of the space better. But as it gets smaller, I'm going to switch back. But notice when it goes down to 1 column, each card temporarily has enough room to use that fancy wide layout again. So it's not it's only caring about itself and how much room it has to do that, which is like just unbelievable territory for CSS. Maybe not the best demo of it, but you make these design systems, the way that you should style that design system should not be thinking about where that component's going to be used. It should only be writing queries that are like, how big am I? I'm going to make design decisions about how big I am right now. So that's a big deal, and that's just whatever. Oh, I'm small, I'm going to be a different layout. You know, the code doesn't matter. It's just an opportunity to do whatever you want. So container queries, can you use them right now? Google shipped a polyfill for it that's as simple as that. You test if it's available. If it's not, you load the friggin' thing, and it works. So the Breakfast Burrito site is using it. It works in all browsers today. So amazing, right? And it's not You don't write some weird syntax, like when it starts shipping in browsers, the polyfill just doesn't load anymore and your code works exactly the same. So that's the perfect kind of thing to polyfill. The caveat, because JavaScript loads, it might like load your page, the CSS might render it, then JavaScript loads, then it flips to the new layout, which is more Flash style content, just like typography was. So that's a bummer. If you're writing in like some client-side rendered JavaScript framework anyway, so what? It won't happen to you because it doesn't render till later anyway. Another little bonus here is that there's a such thing called container units. Remember when we were doing that? We are sizing type based on the size of the viewport again. And now with container units, we can scope that down and say, I actually only want to care about the size of the container itself. Meaning that even though we get container queries, it doesn't really solve like fluid sizing for container units. So on the left, even if we had container units, we still might have to express lots of steps of like, well, when the container's this size, then change the font size. When the container's this size, change it again. Now you don't have to. That weird QU there is a container unit, meaning it's a relative to the size of the container itself, not the thing. And there's like 8 of them, because there's always, CSS is always more complicated than it needs to be, but it's like, is it, because there's width and height and the minimum of both, or the maximum of both, or the, you know what I mean? That's how CSS rolls. But pretty cool though, I think that's cool. This is a demo from Scott Keller showing off how those container units work for font size. So you can see even in the inside of the little units, it's resizing. That's just a nice way to size type. That's a classy way to do it. No JavaScript, nothing involved there other than just.
Can you do flexible fonts inside of container units?
Probably, you know. I mean, you can set your borders with that stuff, and your padding, and your margins, and to me, that's a big deal. Just saying, that's what you all look like to me right now. That's Samurai Jack written in CSS. That's all. This section isn't completely done because I had to wing it here tonight, but I think that when you speak to an audience of all JavaScript people, I think this is a little bit obvious, is that when you build site, you think about, even your pages are components, and then you have a header component, and a sidebar component, and a drop-down component, and a card component, and all that stuff. Because that's just how JavaScript people have been thinking the last, say, decade, or maybe not that long. But it's funny that not everything works that way, and then I feel like that's the right answer, and I feel so strongly about it, I feel like I need to talk about it. The idea of building digital products by thinking of how your organization thinks about components is like the right model, and I'm hoping that to push that forward kind of over time. So the idea of working in components abstractly, it jives with design people because they fire Figma and they make design pattern libraries in tools like that, and that's how they think. So like the synchronicity between design people and front-end people has been strong thanks to the idea of componentry at the JavaScript level, and it works with developer teams too. I feel like the whole rise of GraphQL was like, oh, we think in components now, and each component should ask for its own little bespoke piece of data. Those two things have come together in kind of a big way. Also, Gatsby Conf asked me to give this talk, so I'm kind of trying to throw some Gatsby-esque shit in there for them, which is kind of the vibe there. And maybe. And there's, yeah. I don't care about you, but thanks for having me talk. But what's interesting about that is it wasn't just like React came along and decided that components were a thing. It's the one thing that like every JavaScript framework agrees on. They're like, the programming model for every JavaScript framework has been like, you should probably work in components. Literally all of them have never seen another model any other way. And I think that's cool. Even when new ones come out, they're like, this is how we think components should be. Nobody ever rethinks that because I think we've landed on the way that digital products should be built in a way. And I just mean abstractly that you can ask for one and use it and pass data in that kind of HTML kind of way. That's literally all I mean. That burrito site I put together was in one called Astro, which just invented some other way to do components that, you know. Anyway, this section is not done. That's a rooster. I do want to talk about animation a little bit though, because I think this is compelling, and then we're going to leave it at that. I was saying, like, animation just in the last few years has come a long way. There's for one thing, there's this JavaScript natively has gotten an animation API, which I feel like not everybody even realizes. But if you just have a reference to an element, you can just call .animate on it and pass it an arbitrary array of keyframes to it and some information, and it will just transform it, and it requires no library or anything. It's just native JavaScript animations have just arrived in all browsers. Kind of good to know, I feel like.
When did that happen?
Last couple years, I think, ish, you know. I think this one is particularly cool in CSS that not only can you animate things like opacity and stuff, but you can animate paths of things, which I feel like is not known particularly well. But I just did this not even that long ago. Like, let's say you want that modal to go away. Do you just do opacity? Do you make it like fly at you? What do you do? In this case, it goes whoop. You know, it like moves on a path. And did you see the two lines of code that require? You just give it this like SVG coordinates describing any arbitrary path, and the default offset distance is 0. So if you put I should put a transition on there, right? Like the movement happens because it has a transition on it, like 1 second or whatever. Thanks for the capitalization, really cool. That if you change that, what's that?
May last year is when we first put it.
May.
Pretty new.
Yeah. Ooh, I'll do it again though, because I think it's compelling. That I think that's gonna breed ideas. The fact that you don't have to move things in straight lines or just change the signs. You can move the paths of where they go.
You should throw a Bezier loop in there after doing SVG paths.
Oh yeah. But this is not a native browser concept, but it's just a general concept of how you can approach animations generally. This is years ago, this was coined by a guy named Paul Lewis, I think, but it stands for first, last, invert, play. So the idea is that, let's say you have some stuff on a page and you want to move it over here, that you don't just lay it out here, you lay it out there actually, and then you transform it back to its original position with transforms. Then when you hit play, it can go, which you'd think, why do it in reverse? Well, you do it in reverse because those CSS animations that got it there are super performant because it already like knows where it's going. It's a little complex to do by yourself, but there's lots of libraries that help with it. Let's look at how that works. So I have this dumb breakfast burrito site, and I was like, what if you want to see that one bigger? Well, do you use like jQuery Lightbox or what? I don't even know how you make an image bigger these days. There's I don't even know. Like you're on a Medium post and it goes, but it can't get much bigger than the biggest one anyway. So I wasn't gonna design some elaborate image viewing experience. So my idea was, if you want to see it bigger, why don't they just move to the location, whatever. You'll see what I mean in a second. So if you tapped one, they just rotate one position. So the smaller one becomes the bigger one, which is about as big as you could see the stupid image anyway. So why not? So then you tap it again and it rotates one more position, and that's about as good as you can do. But let's have a little fun with it. So there's the little card and there's 3 images sitting in there. We already saw the DOM in that way. And notice it says state 1 as a class. So I make a little thing that says, well, there's also a state 2 and there's a state 3. And the way I set up the grid template is that in those different states, it moves the images to the position they need to be in. That's just the named grid syntax thing. It's not that elaborate. It looks more elaborate than it is. It just says move the images based on the class name. And then I make the world's dumbest class name changer, meaning that when you click on the image, take off state 1 and put on state 2. Take off state 2 and put on state 3. I also recently blogged about 95 ways to do that because I asked on Twitter, I'm like, how would you make a class name changer in JavaScript? And nerds were like, I got you, bro. And there's 100 ways to do it, which was very fun to see, because that's, I don't know what kind of programming that is, but it's not good, So anyway, so what happens when you put that in place, you tap and it just changes the positions of the image. Fine. Like, that's an okay experience, I guess. But that's where flip comes in, is that what we're doing is changing the state. And so when flip animations happen, you can say, why don't you animate to your new state? So in the case of this, I'm using this green sock animation library, which released this plugin that just says, get the state of these particular DOM elements, and then when you're ready, like perform whatever DOM change crap you're gonna do, but when you're ready, call flip from that previous state and we will animate to the new position. So you don't have to do, you're not writing animate from 38 pixels to 122 pixels ever. You're just saying, here's the initial state, here's the final state, you deal with it. So you put that in place and all it does is that then. Like I'm not writing instructions of how I want those to move around. I just say, save the state, make DOM changes, then run the animation for that. And it just does that. And you can do all kinds of crap. This is a cool demo I saw that just had a grid, and so he's not writing the animations to move those things into the cart. It's just saying, make the DOM change, and then before you do anything, tween it, essentially. Flash or whatever. It's just a concept, like this concept from this guy on CodePen that makes crazy animations. Be hypnotized. That's pretty much the end of it. I'm going to end with talking about how easy hosting has gotten and stuff, and look at edge handlers and stuff, but I didn't even write it yet. So I kind of have to move to the ending where we look at some panda bears. Ooh, I didn't animate that. But I'm just going to end with the idea that we talked about all kinds of stuff like animation and typography and layout and all this stuff that's like, none of that stuff was hard. Like, if I can do it, believe me, you can kind of vibe. And that's stuff that's gotten better like relatively recently, and it has nothing to do with why the web is like a good choice generally. You know, the web has always been a good choice just because of stuff like URLs. That's a pretty solid idea, right, guys? And the fact that I can write one app and my Rocket thing will work on somebody's weird Linux phone or something, and I don't have to like write a a special adapter because somebody has a different phone, Those are the core strengths of the web are just the best. And I feel like I've been doing this a long time, and that like I feel like I've made a good bet for the web, and it just keeps getting better. And I think there's some like cool vibes to that. Like, we didn't screw up. We didn't lose the web. Apple didn't win. We don't have to write stupid Swift apps if we don't want to, Pretty good. I'll work on the ending. But let's call it. We're done. For the streamers.